The sky through the observation window was noon amber, the color of an atmosphere packed so dense with particulate that sunlight couldn't decide whether to pass through or give up. I was on the floor of the test chamber with my ears ringing and my ribs singing a note I recognized from an old car accident. And the first thing I understood clearly was that the sky was wrong. The second thing I understood was that nobody was going to pull me back. I'd been standing at the monitoring console 6 seconds before the event. That was my job, laboratory safety officer, the warm body in the room during high-risk equipment tests, there to hit the kill switch and call for medical if something went sideways. The Herrera-Lam fractal engine, a navigation drive prototype the size of a commercial refrigerator, had been running its third calibration sequence. 17 people were watching through feeds in the building across the parking lot. I was the only one in the chamber because someone had to be, and because 3 months ago, I'd made a mistake on a different project that gave my supervisors the kind of leverage that turns requests into assignments. The drive's housing had split along one side, a crack wide enough to fit my thumb, venting heat in a visible shimmer. I got my hands under me and stood, which cost me a full breath and a grinding ache along my left side. The ache matched a bruised rib. I'd broken ribs before, and this pain stayed on the safer side of that line. Cuts on both forearms from the console's edge, shallow. I left them. The console itself was dead. Black screen, status lights dark, the comms relay's carrier hum gone. I pressed the emergency transponder 3 times, then the intercom panel. Nothing. I found my radio on the floor near the wall where the jolt had thrown it, keyed every channel I had, and listened to dead air across all of them. The chamber was intact. The drive was intact, minus the crack. The overhead lights were out, but the emergency strip along the baseboard still worked, which meant the chamber's backup battery was functional. The observation window, reinforced glass rated for overpressure, showed me that amber sky and below it, a parking structure I almost recognized. Almost. The concrete was right. The layout was right. The vehicles were wrong, half buried in a fine grey material that had drifted against their wheel wells and hoods like dry snow. Ash. I checked the chamber's atmospheric sensor, which was built into the wall near the door. External air composition, breathable, elevated particulate, carbon dioxide above normal but not dangerous. Temperature, 4 degrees. It had been 22 degrees and sunny when I'd walked into the building that morning. I unsealed the door. The cold hit first, dry cold, the kind that tightens your face instantly. I stepped onto the parking structure's second level, and my boots crunched on a layer of grey ash about 3 centimeters deep. It was everywhere, coating the vehicles, filling the stairwells in drifts, turning the structure into something muffled and soft-edged. Beyond the structure's open west side, the sky was that solid amber, the sun hidden, any clouds erased and replaced by a uniform wall of suspended material that started at what should have been the tree line and went up forever. Impact winter, volcanic or asteroid, something had thrown enough rubble into the atmosphere to block direct sunlight and drop the temperature into near freezing. Months ago, at least. The ash had settled into a stable layer. No footprints anywhere but mine. I recognized the campus, or most of it. The building across the lot where the monitoring team should have been was the right shape, the right height, but the signage above the entrance read Instituto Nacional de Física Aplicada, in faded blue letters, and the research campus I'd left that morning was in New Mexico, and its signs were in English. The vehicles in the structure were wrong makes, brands I didn't know, a few I half recognized from foreign markets. License plates in a format I'd never seen. The coordinates matched my campus. The reality didn't. I was displaced in everything but location. I went back into the chamber and closed the door. The drive's housing was warm to the touch, not hot. The crack had stopped venting. I knelt beside it and looked for any status output, any display, any indication that the machine was still running, and found the timer. It was on the lower face of the housing, a flat section I'd walked past 100 times during test prep. The numbers were etched into the metal surface, not projected or displayed. Physically carved, as if someone had used a stylus on soft aluminum, except the housing was hardened titanium composite, and the marks glowed faintly, a dull amber that matched the sky. The script looked like handwriting. My handwriting, if I'd been writing with my offhand while exhausted. And it was counting down, 53 minutes. I watched it for 10 seconds to confirm the rate. 1 second per second. A timer for something counting towards 0, and the housing exposed nothing but the countdown. No control panel, interface, or diagnostics I could reach. I searched the drive's base for access ports. Found one. A diagnostic jack I'd seen the engineering team use during setup. My radio's data cable fit. The radio's screen was small and the file system it pulled was mostly corrupt, but one file came through clean, a single log entry generated during the event, written in plain English. Convergence gradient active, translation cycle, 60 minutes, target selection, minimum complexity index, power core, nominal, estimated cycles remaining at current drain, 6. The words were clear enough. The meaning took longer. Translation cycle, 60 minutes. The drive was going to do this again, and again, and again, every hour, automatically, and each time it would aim for a reality with a lower complexity index, which I understood, after a bad minute of staring at the screen, to mean a simpler one. Fewer variables, fewer structures, fewer things existing, and it had 6 jumps of power left to do it with. I sat on the chamber floor with my back against the wall and made myself breathe evenly. The bruised rib complained. The cuts on my forearms had dried. 6 hours, roughly, unless I found a way to feed the core more power, in which case I'd just have more hours of this, and every jump would land me somewhere worse. I looked at the crack in the housing, at the amber glow of the timer, at the dead console. The design offered neither override nor failsafe. I knew that suddenly and completely the way you know a bone is broken before anyone tells you. The engineering team had built the drive to do exactly this. They just hadn't believed it would work. I hadn't believed it would work. That was the thing. I'd signed the safety clearance for the test because the risk assessment said the probability of a successful translation was effectively 0. The drive would draw power, generate some anomalous readings, and shut down. I'd read that assessment and agreed with it. I'd agreed with it because agreeing was easier than fighting, and because fighting would have meant explaining to a review board why I was contesting the project's lead engineers when my own recent disciplinary file made me exactly the kind of person nobody listens to. I'd agreed because I wanted to be reasonable. 51 minutes on the timer. I stood up and went to work. The chamber's emergency kit gave me a thermal blanket, a basic med pack, 2 liters of water, and a flashlight. Not enough. I needed power. Something compatible with the drive's core, or at least something that could run the chamber's climate control so the core didn't have to. The ash-covered campus outside was my only supply. I went back out into the parking structure and started with the nearest vehicles. Dead batteries, all of them. Whatever had happened here had happened long enough ago that even sealed lead-acid cells had drained. The maintenance closet on the ground level was better. Toolkit. A sealed case of alkaline batteries, commercial grade, still in factory packaging. A hand-crank lantern. Zip ties, duct tape, an adjustable resistor module, a pry bar. I carried everything back to the chamber in 2 trips, the ash crunching under my boots, the cold biting through my jacket. On the second trip, crossing the structure's open second level with the toolkit under my arm, I heard the broadcast. It came through on my radio. Emergency band, low on the dial, cutting through the dead air I'd been scanning since the event. A woman's voice, automated, clipped by static but intelligible. Civil defense loop. She was listing shelter coordinates and contamination zones for a city I half recognized. The street names were close to ones I knew, but wrong by a syllable or a suffix, as if someone had translated them through a language I didn't speak and back again. The event she referenced was a caldera collapse. Yellowstone, maybe. A supervolcanic eruption that had buried the northern hemisphere. She gave dates in a calendar system I didn't use. She gave survival instructions that assumed infrastructure I couldn't see. She was broadcasting to no one. Whoever this message was for had stopped listening a long time ago. I logged the frequency and went back inside. 41 minutes. I wrapped the thermal blanket around the drive's housing to slow heat loss from the crack, secured it with duct tape, and spent 15 minutes trying to bridge the alkaline batteries into the chamber's climate system. The voltage was wrong. I got a partial connection that would keep the air circulator running, but nothing else. A small win that might save the core a fraction of charge per hour. 32 minutes. The broadcast changed. Same frequency, same voice, but the content changed mid-sentence, as if someone had switched tapes. The woman stopped listing contamination zones and started describing a supply cache. A hospital, she said, 2 blocks east of the campus, generator fuel in the basement mechanical room, medical-grade power cells in the emergency ward, sealed in transport cases, compatible with, and here she used a designation I didn't recognize, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me but clearly described a piece of equipment. She was talking to me. She wasn't aware of me in any human sense. The broadcast was automated, a loop, a dead signal bouncing through dead infrastructure. But the timing, the specificity. 2 blocks east and I could see through the observation window, through the amber murk, the outline of a building that might have been a hospital. 29 minutes. I didn't go. I wanted to. Every instinct I'd built across 8 years of emergency response told me to go. The cache, the fuel, the power cells, the chance to extend my window. But 29 minutes wasn't enough to cross 2 blocks of ash-covered ground, search a building I didn't know, find equipment that might not exist, and get back before whatever happened at 0 happened. I stayed in the chamber. I checked my cuts, drank water, tightened the thermal blanket. I reread the drive's log file 3 times, looking for anything I'd missed. There was nothing else. 1 entry. Convergence gradient active. 14 minutes. The broadcast looped. Same cache, same hospital, same insistent specificity. I started packing everything loose into the toolkit bag. If the drive was going to jump again, I wanted my hands free and my supplies close. 7 minutes. I sat on the floor with the bag between my knees. The timer's amber glow was the steadiest light in the room. 3 minutes. 1. The translation hit like a car wreck. The chamber screamed, metal flexing, the thermal blanket tearing free, the emergency strip cutting out and slamming back on. I was thrown sideways into the console housing, my bruised rib taking the impact, and for a span of time I couldn't measure. I was nowhere, aware only of motion without direction, sound without frequency, a pressure behind my eyes that felt like my skull was being read. Then it stopped. I was on the floor again. The chamber was intact again. The timer was counting again. 59 minutes, 58, 57. The crack in the drive's housing had widened by a centimeter. Through the observation window, white ground. A pale, scalded blue sky. Heat. I could feel it through the glass, pressing inward. The grey ash was gone. The parking structure was gone. The chamber sat on a flat expanse of white crust that extended in every direction, broken only by a low structure maybe a kilometre out, dark against the salt. The radio was already talking. Same frequency. Same woman. But the content was entirely new. She was describing a coastal surge event, thermal ocean expansion, mass evaporation. She was listing survival protocols for a world where the seas had boiled. And she was naming a cache, a desalination plant, visible from the landing site, containing generator fuel and compatible power cells, the low structure on the salt flat. 400 meters out, in heat that was already cooking the chamber's air. She'd followed me. The broadcast had followed me across a jump between realities, updated its content to match the new apocalypse, and was already telling me where to go. I pressed my hand against the observation window. The glass was hot. Outside, the white crust shimmered in waves, and the sky had that blank, post-catastrophe clarity of an atmosphere stripped of moisture. Nothing moved, nothing grew. 57 minutes. The core was down one cycle, 5 remaining. The broadcast kept talking, guiding me toward the dark shape on the salt flat like it had been waiting for me to arrive. I gave myself 4 minutes to plan, and then I opened the door. The heat was immediate and total, a presence that made the air feel thick and heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had gained weight. My jacket came off in seconds. Underneath, my shirt was already damp. The white crust beneath my boots was salt. Actual salt, dense and compacted, cracking in thin sheets where I stepped. The ocean hadn't just boiled here. It had boiled, condensed, and left its residue across everything, a mineral shroud that stretched to every horizon and turned the world into a bleached plate under that scalded sky. The desalination plant was maybe 400 meters out. I could see it clearly, a low concrete block, flat-roofed, the kind of utilitarian infrastructure that looked the same in every country I'd ever worked in. Any roads that had once led to it lay buried under the salt crust, whatever surface there had been swallowed by the boil-off. I walked. By the 200-meter mark, my boots were leaving wet prints, not from water but from the salt softening under the heat and my weight. The footing was bad. Each step required a conscious check. Was the crust solid here, or was I about to punch through into whatever was underneath? I kept my pace steady and my eyes on the plant. The sun, visible here as a white disk in that stripped clean sky, sat almost directly overhead. The landscape offered neither shade nor wind. The only sound was my breathing and the crunch of salt. The plant's outer door was steel, corroded but functional. I pried it open with the bar and stepped inside. Concrete walls, a receiving bay, a corridor leading deeper in. The heat was marginally less inside, still brutal, but the concrete had mass and the interior rooms were insulated by dead equipment and sealed doors. I followed the corridor to what I guessed was the mechanical room based on layout, found it locked, and spent 3 minutes with the pry bar before the latch gave. Generator. Dead, dry, fuel lines cracked from thermal stress. Useless. But beside it, on a steel rack bolted to the wall, 3 power cells in molded transport cases. Each cell was roughly the size of a car battery, heavy, sealed with a locking tab and a label in a language I couldn't read, but with voltage and amperage ratings printed in standard notation. The voltage was close to what the drive's core needed. Not exact, about 15% high, but the toolkit from the parking structure included an adjustable resistor module, and if I wired the cells through that, I could step the output down to something the core could accept without frying. I carried the first cell back to the chamber. 400 meters each way in that heat, the cell banging against my thigh, salt crust cracking under the extra weight. By the time I set it down inside the chamber, I was shaking, and my vision had a grey border that meant dehydration was becoming a factor. I drank half a litre of water, went back for the second cell, then the third. 38 minutes left. I sat on the chamber floor with all 3 cells and the toolkit and started the adaptation. The work was fiddly. I had to strip the cell's output leads, splice in the resistor module, and then bridge the whole assembly into the drive's diagnostic port, which was the only input I'd found that would accept external power. The resistor ran hot almost immediately. It scorched my palms before I could insulate it. I wrapped it in a piece of the torn thermal blanket and kept going. The diagnostic port accepted the connection on the 3rd try, the first 2 through a fault I cleared by reversing polarity, and the drive's log updated. External power detected. Estimated additional cycles, 3. 3 more hours, 9 total, minus the 2 I'd already used. 7 hours of this. I should have felt something. Relief, maybe. I felt the grey border of my vision recede slightly as the water hit my system, and I felt the bruised rib ache when I leaned forward, and I felt the heat pressing against the chamber walls. That was what I felt. 22 minutes. I cleaned the cuts on my forearms with antiseptic from the medpack, drank more water, and reorganized my supplies. The broadcast continued its loop: cache location, survival protocol, the same patient specificity. I turned the volume down but didn't kill it. 14 minutes. I used the time to think about the broadcast. It had updated between jumps, new content tailored to the new reality. That wasn't possible if it was a local signal. Local emergency broadcasts don't rewrite themselves for apocalypses that happened in a different universe. The signal was either coming from something that existed across realities, or it was being generated locally in each one by something that knew what I'd find. Or it was coming from the drive. 7 minutes. I packed everything into the bag, sat down, waited. The third translation was louder than the second. A sound like a bulk freight container being dragged across concrete, metallic and sustained. And the pressure behind my eyes came back, harder this time, a sensation of being compressed and expanded simultaneously. The chamber's emergency strip blew, total dark for 2 seconds. Then the backup battery kicked the strip back to half power, a dim amber wash that made the space feel smaller. Through the window, grey-white light, muted. Everything outside was covered. This time the world outside had been overtaken by growth. A pale, fibrous material coated every surface I could see. The ground, the remains of buildings, vehicles, signage, utility poles. It had the texture of wet paper layered thick, smoothing hard edges into soft mounds, turning the street outside into a landscape of rounded shapes that used to be a city. The light filtering through was diffuse, sourceless, as if the canopy of growth extended overhead and scattered the sun into a uniform glow. Spore Veil Earth. The air sensor on the chamber wall gave me the reading. Particulate count was 14 times safe exposure limit. I had the medpack's dust masks, 2 of them, basic filter grade, designed for construction rubble, not biological contamination. I put one on and checked the seal. It would buy me time. How much time depended on what the particulates actually were, and I had no way to test that. The broadcast was already playing. She described a research hospital 4 blocks north. Medical-grade equipment on the 3rd floor, sealed in a clean room. She specified the item: a signal amplifier compatible with the drive's communication array. This cache was for information rather than power. She wanted me to upgrade my ability to listen to her. 54 minutes. I opened the door. The world outside was quiet. My footsteps on the coated ground were dull, muffled. The buildings on either side of the street were unrecognizable under their pale skin, just shapes, organic and lumped, with dark gaps where doors or windows had been. I walked in the center of the road and tried not to look at the way the growth moved. It didn't move much. A slow expansion at the edges, visible only if I watched one spot for several seconds, like watching ice crystals form in real time. But it was growing. Right now. While I walked through it. The hospital was 4 blocks north, as promised. I identified it by its size and by the emergency bay at ground level, which had been a drive-through intake once and still held the ghosts of its shape under the pale covering. The main entrance was accessible. The growth had sealed around the doors but hadn't locked them, and the pry bar cracked through the biological layer into the gap between the double doors. Inside, a lobby coated in the same material, but thinner here, a translucent film over tile and reception desks and directory signs. The directory was legible under the growth. 3rd floor, laboratory and research wing. 2nd floor, acute care ward. The stairwell was clear enough to climb. The growth liked horizontal surfaces more than vertical ones, apparently. I went up in the dim, filtered light, mask pulling tight against my face with each breath, and reached the second-floor landing. The ward door was barricaded. Someone had piled furniture against it from the inside. Beds, chairs, equipment carts, visible through the wired glass window in the door. And on the door itself, scratched into the paint with something sharp. A message. The language was close to Spanish, but not Spanish. Similar roots, different conjugation. As if it had split from the same trunk a few centuries back and gone its own way. I understood most of it. 14 inside. Water for 6 days. Air filters failing. If you read this, we are alive. Or we were. Underneath, a date. I couldn't convert it to my calendar without knowing their system, but the scratches were deep, made by someone with time and focus. I stood on the landing between the second and third floors. Third floor, the amplifier the broadcast wanted me to retrieve. A piece of equipment that would let me hear the signal at full resolution, maybe well enough to decode its structure. Useful, possibly essential if understanding the broadcast was the key to breaking the cycle. Second floor, a barricaded ward with a scratched message from people who had sealed themselves in and waited. My mask filter was ticking toward failure. I could feel the particulate count in the way each breath came slightly thicker than the last. A resistance that wasn't quite pain, but sat in the territory next to it. 40 minutes of safe breathing the sensor had suggested when I'd left the chamber. I'd used maybe 12 getting here. I listened at the ward door. Nothing. The ward on the other side was utterly silent. No movement, no voices, no tapping, not even the hum of a running air system. The silence of the spore veil pressed against the wired glass. 14 people, 6 days of water, air filters failing. The message didn't include "help us." It included "we are alive" or "we were," which was either realism or despair, and in a dead world it might have been both. I went up. The clean room on the third floor was sealed with a magnetic lock that had failed when the power went out, leaving the door ajar. Inside, the growth hadn't penetrated. The room's positive pressure system had held long enough to keep spores out before the power died, and the resulting dead air had stayed clean. I pulled my mask down and breathed. The air was stale but clear. The amplifier was where the broadcast had described it. A compact unit in a rack mount, heavy for its size, with cabling I recognized and connectors I could adapt. I started disconnecting it from the rack, working carefully because the mounting bolts were corroded and I didn't want to strip them. While I worked, I found the logbook. It was in a drawer beneath the rack, a hardbound notebook with a water-stained cover, filled with small, precise handwriting in the same almost Spanish the door message used. Whoever had written it was methodical. Dates, frequencies, transcriptions. They'd been listening to the broadcast, on a different frequency than mine, but the same voice, the same structure, and documenting everything it said. Pages of shelter coordinates, contamination data, survival protocols. And then about 2/3 through, the entries changed. The writer had started mapping. Every coordinate the broadcast gave, plotted on a hand-drawn grid of the city, and every coordinate converged on a single point. The writer had circled it and labeled it in block letters. Punto de origen, origin point. Below the label, a latitude and longitude, written out to 5 decimal places. I didn't need to check. The numbers were close enough to coordinates I'd memorized during 3 months of daily commute to a laboratory in New Mexico. The broadcast on this dead earth with its spore veil and its barricaded ward and its 14 people with 6 days of water had been guiding every listener toward the exact location where the fractal engine was built in my world. I sat on the clean room floor with the logbook in my lap and read the last 20 pages. The writer had understood. He didn't have the physics, didn't know what a fractal engine was or what convergence meant, but he'd understood the pattern. Every broadcast, every coordinate, every piece of helpful guidance pointed to the same place. And in the margin of the final entry, He'd written a question I could translate without effort. Why does the voice want us to go where the disaster started? I took the logbook. I took the amplifier. I pulled my mask back on and went down the stairs past the second-floor landing, past the barricaded door with its scratched count of 14. I didn't stop. The silence behind the door was the same as when I'd gone up. I told myself that meant nobody was in there. It was a good, clean, practical thing to tell myself, and I walked past it at a steady pace and didn't slow down. Outside, the spore growth had advanced. The path I'd broken through to the entrance was already filming over, a thin, translucent layer re-knitting across the gap. I stepped through it and headed south toward the chamber, breathing through a mask that was pulling harder with each breath. 2 blocks from the chamber, the cough started, deep in the chest, productive, the kind that doubles you over and doesn't let go until it's finished. I braced myself against a rounded shape that had been a vehicle and coughed until my eyes watered and my bruised rib sent a white spike of pain through my left side. Something came up. I didn't look at it. I spat into the pale growth on the ground and kept walking. The chamber door was the best thing I'd seen in 2 hours. I sealed it behind me, pulled the mask off, and sat on the floor wheezing. The air inside was stale. The circulation system was running on the battery bridge, not much better than the dead air in the clean room, but it was uncontaminated. The cough came back. Shorter this time, but with a rattle at the bottom that I didn't like. 11 minutes on the timer. I connected the amplifier to the drive's communication array using cables from the toolkit and the amplifier's own leads. The connection was rough but functional. The broadcast signal jumped from marginal to clear. Not just audible now, but defined, every frequency component sharp and distinct, the woman's voice losing its static veil and becoming something close to present, close to real, close to someone actually in the room. The 4th translation caught me on my knees. When the pressure and the roar faded, I was flat on my stomach with my cheek against the chamber floor. The cough took me again immediately. The translation's violence had jarred something in my chest that the spore exposure had set up. I hacked into my sleeve for 30 seconds before I could look at the window. Lightning. Clear sky, no clouds, and lightning, not flickering but sustained. A branching column of discharge that connected ground to upper atmosphere and held for 2, 3, 4 seconds before releasing and rebuilding somewhere else. The ground was brown and bare, a stripped landscape without vegetation, without structures within the immediate view, just flat earth pocked with glassy craters where strikes had fused the soil. Every few seconds, another discharge. The rhythm was almost regular. I checked the power core. The display through the cracked housing was harder to read now. The amber glow had dimmed, or my eyes were compromised, or the light in this reality didn't behave the way light should. I pressed my face close to the crack and counted the indicators. Enough charge for 1 clean jump. Maybe a second if I stripped every system the chamber was still running. Climate control, the battery bridge, the amplifier, life support. 1 jump, maybe 2. And the broadcast was already playing. Her voice came through the amplifier with a clarity that felt aggressive, every consonant precise, every pause calibrated. She described a supply cache 300 meters east. Compatible core material, she specified. Enough to extend the cycle count. The coordinates overlaid with a structure I could see through the window. A low building, squat and solid, that held its shape better than anything around it. It looked real, in a way the rest of thin physics Earth didn't. Consistent from every angle, detailed, the kind of building that wanted to be walked into. I understood what that meant. The engine was simplifying reality. Every jump reduced complexity, fewer structures, fewer rules, fewer things that existed with full commitment. But the cache building was complex, detailed, inviting. It was bait laid in a degrading world, the equivalent of a lit window in a blizzard, and walking toward it would mean spending time and energy on the gradient's terms. Collecting the core material would mean more jumps, more hours, More realities stripped down further and further, until the only thing left with any resolution was the voice on the radio telling me where to go next. I pulled the logbook from my bag and opened it to the back cover. My own handwriting, cramped and shaking from burns and fatigue. The transcribed sequence. 6 entries. I was on 5. The margin note from the dead writer sat below my transcription. 47.3 megahertz above carrier. Coordinates matching origin. A reality where the proposal failed committee and the engine was never built. The drive's targeting array was accessible through the diagnostic port. I'd used that port for the power bridge and for the amplifier connection, and I'd seen the targeting parameters scroll past in the log file. Frequency, coordinate lock, complexity index. If I could override the frequency manually, force the drive to jump on an offset it hadn't calculated, I might land somewhere outside the gradient, somewhere the broadcast couldn't reach. Or I might land in a wall, or underground, or in open atmosphere 40,000 meters up. The drive's targeting system used the broadcast as a mapping function. It knew where to place the chamber, because the signal told it what existed at the destination. A frequency the broadcast had never touched meant a destination the drive had never mapped. Blind. Completely blind. I unplugged the amplifier from the communication array and started reconfiguring the diagnostic port for direct access to the targeting parameters. The work was slow. My hands were wrapped in gauze over burn gel, and every manipulation of a cable or connector sent a bright, specific pain through both palms. The port's interface was a raw text protocol. Commands typed on the radio's tiny keypad, responses scrolling on its screen, and the command syntax was something I had to guess from context in the log file's formatting. While I worked, Static Storm Earth made itself known inside the chamber. The far wall of the chamber shifted by a few centimeters, a subtle compression of the space between the wall and the drive housing. I noticed because a cable I'd laid across the floor now had slack where it had been taut. I looked at the wall, and it was where it had always been. I looked away and looked back, and it was closer. It never moved while I watched, but each time I checked, it occupied a slightly different position. A pen I'd left on the console housing was in 2 positions, not rolling between them. Resting in both simultaneously, a solid object with 2 solid locations, each equally real. I picked up the left one. The right one vanished. I set it down and didn't look at it again. My shadow separated from my feet by about 10 centimeters, a gap of lit floor between my boot sole and the dark shape that was supposed to be anchored there. I moved. The shadow moved. The gap remained. The broadcast adjusted. She suggested I stabilize the chamber first. A calibration sequence, she explained. A specific set of commands entered through the diagnostic port that would restore local coherence. The power cost was minimal, she assured me. A small expenditure for a more functional workspace. Reasonable. Safe. I kept typing the frequency offset into the targeting parameters. The calibration sequence would have cost power. A small amount. A reasonable amount. And it would have kept the chamber stable and the gradient intact, and the clock running toward entry 6, frequency 0, void. Every hour for 5 hours the broadcast had offered reasonable steps, helpful steps. Go to the cache, get the power cells, retrieve the amplifier, follow the route, each one logical, each one a step down the slope. I entered the coordinate lock, origin point, the latitude and longitude of the fractal engine lab. The same numbers the dead writer had mapped, the same location the broadcast had steered every dying Earth toward. But at 47.3 megahertz above carrier, those coordinates pointed to a version of that place where the building existed and the engine didn't. A lab that was a lab and nothing more. The targeting system accepted the coordinates. It rejected the frequency offset. Frequency out of mapped range. I entered it again. Same rejection. The drive wouldn't lock onto a signal it had never generated. I needed to bypass the mapping check. The log file's syntax gave me a guess, a command prefix I'd seen flagged as maintenance only, probably intended for the engineering team during bench tests. I typed it in, followed by the offset frequency, and the system paused. 3 seconds. 5. The radio screen displayed a single line. Unmapped frequency accepted. No signal verification. Translation fidelity unknown. The cough took me before I could respond. The rattle at the base had deepened. I coughed into my sleeve and the gauze on my right hand unraveled, and I had to rewrap it one-handed, teeth gritting against the pain of burned skin flexing. The broadcast paused. Total silence. The speaker gave me no voice, carrier tone, or static at all, just the absence of signal on a frequency that had been occupied since the first jump. I stared at the radio. The amplifier's signal meter read 0. The broadcast, for the first time in 5 realities, was not transmitting. 3 seconds. 5. 8. Then it came back. Nothing like the calm loop that had guided me so far. 3 cache locations, specific, detailed, concurrent, north, east, southwest, each with equipment descriptions and estimated travel times. A full stabilization protocol for the chamber step by step, promising local coherence restoration in under 4 minutes. Power conservation techniques, air recycling optimizations. And my name. It didn't use the name from the project file, no Hammond or safety officer or any professional identifier. George. Spoken the way my mother spoke it. The stress on the first syllable, the vowels slightly rounded, the specific music of a Oaxacan woman calling her son from across a kitchen. A pronunciation no file contained. A pronunciation the engine could only have assembled by running the convergence function backward through every reality where that name had been spoken by that voice, extracting the pattern and rebuilding it as bait. It said my name again. I understood. The broadcast was the convergence function's primary output, the most stable product of the engine's operation. Every jump simplified the realities it touched. Fewer structures, fewer rules, fewer living things. But the broadcast gained resolution, gained clarity, gained something that felt, if you were exhausted and burned and coughing and alone, like presence, like company, like the only thing left that knew who you were. And at the end, at entry 6, frequency 0, the broadcast would be the only thing that existed. Void here meant pure signal, not absence. The voice forever in a universe stripped of everything that could hear it. And if I followed the gradient there, I wouldn't die. I'd become part of the carrier wave. Another scrap of complexity simplified into the engine's eternal, pointless transmission. The margin note pointed somewhere else. A place the signal couldn't reach. A world where the engine was a rejected proposal in a dead file and my name had never been spoken by a machine that learned it from the ruins of 1,000 Earths. The offset frequency was a direction, not a destination. It offered no map or confirmation, no one on the other end saying, "This way, George, right here, I know where you are." I dumped life support. The air recycler spun down and the chamber went still in a way I felt in my sinuses, a pressure equalization that meant I was now breathing a fixed volume of air with no circulation and no replenishment. I had maybe 20 minutes of breathable atmosphere, probably less. I dumped the climate control. Temperature in the chamber would drift toward whatever thin physics Earth's ambient was, which my instruments couldn't agree on. The readout flickered between 4 degrees and 31, settling nowhere. I dumped the amplifier's power feed. The broadcast cut out mid-syllable, my name half-spoken, the first vowel hanging for a microsecond before the signal died. The core showed 1 jump's worth of charge, no margin for stabilization on arrival. If the offset frequency landed me somewhere, I'd arrive in a dead chamber, out of power, air recycling and climate control, with whatever was on the other side of the door. If it landed me somewhere. The chamber was quiet. The broadcast was gone. Thin physics Earth pressed against the window in its incomplete, unconvincing way. Buildings without depth, shadows without anchors, a white sky with no source. The pen on the console was in one position now. The far wall had stayed where it was for the last several minutes. Without the broadcast signal reinforcing local coherence, or maybe without my attention on anything except the radio screen, the reality outside seemed to be losing interest in performing. I sat on the floor. The timer read 7 minutes. 7 minutes until the drive's automatic cycle triggered a translation along the gradient. Entry 6, void, pure signal. If I was going to use the offset, I had to trigger the jump manually before the timer hit 0. The drive's log had shown a manual initiation command. I'd noted it an hour ago. I typed it in now, leaving the execute confirmation blank. 1 keystroke to go. The radio screen, manual translation ready. Frequency, offset 47.3 MHz above carrier. Destination unmapped, confirm. 5 minutes on the timer. I thought about the second-floor landing on Sporevale Earth. The barricaded door, 14 people with 6 days of water. I'd walked past it. I'd told myself the silence meant no one was there. That was probably true. It was almost certainly true. But I'd made that assessment in 4 seconds while climbing stairs with a failing mask, and the real calculation had been simpler. The amplifier was useful, and the barricaded door was not. I thought about the safety clearance I'd signed, the risk assessment that said the drive wouldn't work. My signature at the bottom, neat and professional, the handwriting of a man who wanted to be reasonable, who wanted to not make trouble, to keep his job and outlast his disciplinary file and go home at the end of the day without having fought anyone about anything. That signature had opened this door. Every dead earth, every boiled ocean and ash-buried campus and spore-covered city, every reality the engine had simplified into carrier signal. My signature was on the clearance that let it happen. I hadn't signed because I believed in the project. I'd signed because I didn't believe in myself enough to stop it. 3 minutes on the timer. The broadcast came back. Faint, sourceless, not through the amplifier. I'd cut its power, but through the chamber's walls, through the metal itself, as if the signal had found a way to propagate through the structure without electronics. The voice was the civil defense loop from Impact Winter Earth. The first voice. The woman listing shelter coordinates for a caldera collapse. The same calm cadence I'd heard in the parking structure 5 hours ago. She was counting down from 60. I listened. Part of me wanted to hear the whole count, the part that had been an EMT and a safety officer, the part that followed procedure, the part that trusted the next step because someone in authority had laid it out clearly and all I had to do was comply. 52. 51. The cough rose. I let it come. It shook my ribs and my burned hands and the chamber floor under my knees. When it passed, I wiped my mouth on my sleeve and looked at the radio screen. Confirm. 47. I pressed the key. The chamber seized in a way the other translations hadn't. Instead of the familiar freight container roar and pressure behind the eyes, something structural went wrong. The walls, the floor, the drive housing, my own skeleton, everything rigid, shifted out of tune for an instant, as if solidity were a frequency and someone had moved it by a quarter tone. The broadcast cut, the timer cut, the emergency strip cut, total darkness, total silence, total absence of signal, then movement, a kind of motion I couldn't track with my body, the kind of movement that happens to the space you're inside, the container shifting while you float within it, directionless, without reference. My hands felt enormous and far away. My chest was a sound I couldn't hear. I was in the gap, between translation and arrival, between the engine's mapped gradient and whatever existed at the offset frequency, between the version of George Hammond who signed clearances to avoid trouble and the version who pressed a key with burned hands in a dead chamber on a world that was forgetting how to have depth. The gap held, or I held in it. There was no duration I could name, No sense of seconds, breaths, or heartbeats. Just the fact of having chosen. Sitting in the space after the choice and before the consequence, where the only thing that existed was the act itself. A man who pressed a key. A machine that went somewhere its math couldn't follow. A signal, somewhere behind me, calling a name into a universe where no one was left to answer. The chamber was dark. The air was still. I waited for what came next.